The horror of the night. When I was just 13 years old, my mother and I lived in a small village called Deskoy, nestled somewhere within the North America. One peculiar night, my mother was attending the funeral of our local mullah, a holy man, where every adult in the village was expected to show up. I was left alone at home, yet decided to invite my friends over for a football match and some video games before we all parted ways for the night. Once alone, I settled into the couch, tuning into some late-night television, but a sudden allergic reaction compelled me to surrender to my drowsiness instead. I preferred the comfort of the downstairs couch to the eerie solitude of my upstairs bedroom, and so I drifted off to sleep there. A strange, echoing thud from outside jolted me awake. Peering out the window, I saw our apple tree quivering. Initially dismissing it as some mischievous child pilfering apples, I decided to let it slide. Yet the noise persisted. A part of me wanted to confront the intruder, but I refrained. Once more I directed my gaze out the window, and this time a chilling sight awaited me. A being, standing nearly 2 meters tall with a grotesquely elongated neck, was shaking the tree. To my absolute horror, it began moving towards the house. In a panic, I rushed to check the locks, realizing that the tree shaking might have been a ploy to lure me outside. I contemplated switching on the lights, but was jolted by a knock on the window. Then another. Petrified, I turned around to witness an unthinkable sight. Its face was covered with blisters, eyes milky white and devoid of pupils, a slit for a mouth from which 2 rows of sharp teeth protruded. I realized it seemed unaware of the glass barrier and couldn't see me as I hadn't turned on the lights. As it began inching towards the door, I froze. I could hear the echoing sound of its steps. It leaned against the door as if listening. I sat there, my breath heavy, holding back tears. It seemed to retreat, leaving a dreadful silence in its wake. But my allergies acted up again, making my nose stuffy. I struggled to control my breathing, but the discomfort was too much, and a loud, unpleasant snort escaped me. Immediately, the creature resumed its advances, now furiously banging against the door. Acting on adrenaline, I darted towards the backyard window, flung it open, and fled towards the funeral, the creature's ominous footsteps echoing behind me. Upon reaching the funeral, I received stern looks for being a child at an adult's funeral, but I knew the trade-off was worth it. Anything was better than facing that monstrosity. I spent the rest of the night at the graveyard, awaiting dawn with the grown-ups. I relayed the tale to my mother the next morning, but she dismissed it as a result of me watching too many horror movies. The scratches on the door and the nearly leafless apple tree served as chilling reminders of the night's horror, but she wrote it off as our boys' night gone too far. I didn't protest, but I knew what I'd seen and what had transpired. I inquired among the locals about this creature, packaging my query as a legend I'd heard of. While they initially doubted, they told me of a similar creature from folklore known as Zeshtao, or translated to English, the horror of the night. The Eerie Homestead. This spine-chilling tale is from my mother's childhood, involving her family. Born in Egypt, she was one of 6 siblings, along with her parents and grandmother, all crammed into a tiny house. When she was just 5 years old, my grandfather made a monumental decision to leave Egypt and settle in Georgia. They found a house relatively quickly. It was spacious, with a kitchen and even a bathroom, a luxury back then. My grandmother was most astounded by the house's price. It was shockingly affordable. Upon their first visit to inspect the property, the one thing that profoundly imprinted on my young mother's mind was a peculiar room. The room had an earthen floor, an odd feature for such a house. The walls were painted stark white, and in the corners were haunting paintings of ballerinas in black tutus, their faces twisted into savage snarls, teeth bared. The sight left everyone in shock. The other rooms, thankfully, seemed ordinary. After inquiring with the neighbors, they discovered that the house previously belonged to an artist's family, who lived there briefly, only a couple of years, before hastily selling it. They moved in after a couple of weeks of renovations. Initially, all seemed peaceful, but that tranquility didn't last long. A couple of years later, strange occurrences began. A kitchen drawer would fall open, spilling out cutlery, or the rack holding dishes would crash down. With each passing month, the situation became progressively worse. My grandmother believed that a mischievous house spirit, not a friendly one, had taken up residence. Animals would refuse to enter the house, terrified. Most often, they would bolt away, never to return. Only one cat and a dog, who lived an astounding 25 years, managed to acclimate to the house over many years. One evening, my grandmother found herself alone in the house. The older children had married and moved away. My mother and grandfather were working night shifts, and the youngest of my mother's sisters was at a sleepover. My grandmother went to bed, dozing off when she heard the door creak as if someone were shuffling in slippers. At first, she thought her husband had returned and called his name. Only silence answered, but the footfalls kept growing closer. Frightened, she pulled the blanket over her head, hoping to block out the dreadful sounds. Suddenly, she felt as if someone pulled the blanket off her legs, and she felt the weight of a small, furry body. Petrified, she asked whether its intentions were good or evil. In response, the creature gave a ghastly laugh and slid off her legs. Every time my grandmother found herself alone at night, the same eerie scenario would unfold. The spectral creature would crawl ever higher upon her body, until one frightful night it began to choke her. Still, my grandmother was a sharp-witted woman. She managed to fling it off. The aftermath of this chilling event lingered around her neck in the form of nasty bruises. After this incident, the family made sure never to leave her alone at night. The suffocating ceased, but the unsettling shuffling, coughing, and eerie giggling were occasionally still audible. In 1980, my grandfather fell ill with liver cancer. His battle with the disease lasted about a year. Then one evening in the summer of 1981, my grandmother wanted to visit the bathroom before bed. Opposite their porch was a gazebo, a favorite summertime hangout for meals and rest. It even had a bed for the nights when she had to be alone. As she approached, she saw a strange sight. There sat a man, unusually small in stature, dressed peculiarly, smoking and persistently coughing. Petrified, she retreated into the house. That very night, my grandfather passed away. Who was that figure? We can't be sure. A neighbor, however, speculated that the creature had come from my grandfather's soul. When my grandmother passed away at the age of 68, the house was quickly sold. During my summer visits to my uncle, who lived in the same village, I would always find myself wandering back to that street, curious about the fate of my grandmother's house. A neighbor shared that the house often changed hands, with an eerie observation that it was women, not men, who suffered at the hands of this malevolent entity. Poltergeist. 2 summers ago, my grandmother received an invitation from a childhood friend. The friend, a widow living alone in a private house in the suburbs of Sevastopol, longed for some company. Her daughters had moved away, her husband had long passed, and her days were spent alleviating the loneliness of old age with companions from her past. On her first night in the new house, my grandmother was jolted awake by a terrifying racket downstairs. The friend had a cat, and initially she assumed the noise was caused by it. However, when she left her room intending to quiet the frantic animal, she realized the cat wasn't to blame. The suspected culprit was huddled under the dining table, its back arched, hissing in fear, its eyes wild. The kitchen was the site of horrific chaos, as if an unseen force from beyond was wreaking havoc. Cupboards opened by themselves, dishes, bowls, and cutlery flew around, crashing to the floor. It was accompanied by the slamming of doors and thuds against the walls, as if large stones were being thrown inside the house. My grandmother said the living room was so cold her breath fogged up. This paranormal activity lasted for about 30 minutes. The kitchen was completely wrecked. All the fragile dishes shattered and the cupboards and drawers ruthlessly overturned. The final act of the supernatural phenomena was a brilliant flare as every light bulb in the house burned out. The terrified cat wailed until the chaos subsided, then bolted out of the house through the cat flap. Cats, it seems, see more than we do. What happened at my grandmother's friend's house was a classic case of a poltergeist. The friend's late husband had always disapproved of his wife's friends and their husbands. He tried to isolate her from all her friends, often leading to arguments and disputes. The constant bickering and squabbles wore him out, sending him to his grave prematurely. The friend had hung a portrait of her husband in the living room. Whether it was a good idea is a matter of debate. Photos of the dead are believed to drain the living of their vitality and attract negative energy from beyond. Since the portrait was displayed, the friend complained of a rapid decline in her health. Although medical examinations found no significant deviations from her age's norm. It's close to the truth to say the husband's ghost is siphoning her life away. It feeds off her energy and the energy of the surrounding environment, allowing him to manifest on the physical plane. The portrait serves as his portal from the world of the dead, guided by his wife's hidden grief. He crosses the threshold to her, not wishing her harm, and possibly unaware that he's slowly killing her. The chaos in the kitchen was his protest against the arrival of those he deeply resented in life. The mysterious feline. It was my friend who arranged a job for me at a store. She worked next door. One freezing December night, as we stood together during our shift, we heard a shrill squeal. It was as if the sound had frozen in the chill air before shattering. Rounding the corner from where the noise had come, we discovered 3 kittens. Being compassionate, we fed them, provided some old rags for comfort. From that point on, our every shift became a mission to care for these kittens. Over time, we managed to find homes for 2 of them, thanks to their striking beauty. But the third, a plain tabby, was a different story. I decided to take him home to the village, dubbing him Modi. My mother was resolute against Modi. "Get that audacious creature out," she would say. Nevertheless, she respected Modi's fierce feline character. As he grew older, even the neighborhood dogs feared him. When a pack of strays would storm the yard, Modi wouldn't flee, he'd just stare, causing the dogs to retreat. I had never seen a cat like him. One day my mother fell gravely ill. She was often hospitalized, only returning home on the weekends. She was due for surgery, with doctors offering little hope. I recall a particular Saturday. My mother, sister, and I were seated in the living room, engaged in conversation. Suddenly, our old doll carriage, an eerie replica of a real one that we had kept from our childhood, began to move. It rocked back and forth, then started billowing as if someone were underneath the blanket covering it. It would inflate and deflate repeatedly. We stared, transfixed, as the room filled with a pungent medicinal smell, growing so potent it was suffocating. All our cats scattered, except for Modi. He calmly approached the frantic carriage, observed it for a moment, and began striking it with his paws. 1, 2, 3. Suddenly an electric jolt seemed to pass through me. I needed to get rid of that carriage. I snatched it and tossed it outside, thankful that we lived in a ground floor house. Outside was December weather, just like the day we found Modi, but with heavier snowfall. Modi immediately wanted to go outside. By morning, the carriage was still outside untouched. There were tracks leading from the carriage into the woods. They were cat tracks, ordinary but unusually deep, as if the cat had been carrying a load. After this incident, my mother's health miraculously improved, no surgery needed. Modi, however, never returned. But I still remember the look in his eyes as he hit that carriage. It was as if he was not fighting for life, but against death.